festivities. My name's Charity. I'm the book curator here at Artifacts Bookstore, which means that I just get to spend a lot of my time with these, and it's wonderful, it's lovely. If you've been to one of these before, you'll kind of know how these usually work. We'll start with this part, the very enriching educational bit, and then we will move on to the just fun bit. So that'll be like your reward for sitting through this. Oh, but we're gonna have a great time. We're gonna have a great time. And we'll get to that at the, what am I saying? So first we'll begin with this little talk here. We'll have about 10-ish minutes maybe for you to come up and look at these books, handle them, ask questions if you have them, and then also start ushering into the gallery where we will have our little afternoon tea, which will consist of actually lemonade, because the tea would have been too hot and it would have melted the glue on the cheap teacups that we got, so it's lemonade instead, which is still period accurate. And there'll also be some parlor games you mingle and say polite and witty things to each other to your heart's content. Yes, so there is that. Are there any questions about the order of the evening? It's pretty straightforward. Mostly you just have to sit there until I tell you don't have to sit there anymore, and then you walk to where you're supposed to sit at the second half. Okay, yeah, so let us begin. So it is Jane-uary, obviously, but it's also January. And January comes, as we know, bringing in the new year, bringing in the new you, making goals, making resolutions, and we're going to do that for this presentation. So what I usually like to have some kind of thesis statement or some kind of goal that we're working towards, something, some educational whatever. I'm very tired. We're going to see if we can make it through this. But for this one, it's three-pronged. One, we have this really unique opportunity to be able to work with these rare editions, and I want to take advantage of that. And so we're not just going to be talking about Jane Austen, we're going to be talking about kind of Jane Austen in print, her textual history, kind of what made her what she is today. And of course, with text comes readers, many of whom are sitting here tonight. So we're going to be looking at some of the people who are interacting with these rare editions and hopefully telling some interesting stories about them. It should be fun. We'll have a good time. Now, because this is a textual history, and because I'm me and I like to have a gimmick go with every one of these presentations, let's kind of get into the right mindset. We're still in Jane-uary, but it's like book Jane-uary. Jane-uary by a book curator lady. Here she is. In 3 volumes. Volume 1, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. So we're gonna, obviously be talking about Jane Austen in print, people, how they received and perceived her as a writer. But first, we need to understand who was Jane as a reader herself, and how did she become the writer that she became. And we must, of course, start in the beginning with Jane's birth, which happened in the village of Steventon on the 16th of December, 1775. This December will mark her 250th birthday. Anyway, so 16th December 1775, when Steventon Rectory and the Reverend George Austen and his wife Cassandra welcome into their home the 7th of 8 children, Jane, whom they, at least for the first day, called Jenny. There we go. She's been born. We have that out of the way. Now let's talk about the birth of Jane Austen as a reader. So, something to understand about Austen and the time in which she's growing up is she's coming of age at the same time that novels are coming of age. Novels are a relatively new genre of literature. And back in the 18th and early 19th century, they were kind of second-class literature. Trashy, if you will. But one of the great things about Jane Austen and her family, it's a really good family to grow up in if you're destined to be one of the greatest novelists in the English language. Because even though novels were regarded as kind of trashy back in the day, the Austen family didn't care. They all read them. They were all great novel readers, as Jane says in this letter which she wrote when she was 23. The story is she goes into this circulating library, which is basically just a library you pay for a subscription, you can take out books. And she tells her sister Cassandra in this letter that the woman who ran the library, Mrs. Martin, was very emphatic in assuring Jane that this collection consists not only of novels, but of every kind of literature, etc., etc. And Jane comes out with this line: she might have spared the pretension to our family, who are great novel readers and not ashamed of being so. I do think it's interesting, the timing of this letter, this is 1798, because it's at this time that she's also drafting the novel that will become Northanger Abbey, although at this time it's called Susan. And in Northanger Abbey, there's, welcome in. In Northanger Abbey, there is this very famous passage that most scholars call the defense of the novel. And in it, it's Austen like calling all novelists to arms, rushing to their defense, saying, like, no, let's be proud of this genre that we work in. Let's band together. Let's stop deriding ourselves. Let's stop this self-deprecation, because it's a novel. It's only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest diffusion of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. And this is why I don't call it the defense of the novel. This is why I call it the 5th chapter of the Gospel of St. Jane. Because she is just, it's just this beautiful moment of Jane, you know, rallying to the defense of what the genre that will become kind of the mainstream literature in a few decades. And I will say that I think Austen's novels do fit this description. However, I'm not convinced that all novels at the time fit this description. Some of them were very weird. So, mic drop moment. So who were these novelists that Austen was reading? Who were these novelists that inspired her to begin novel writing and then also to defend novel writing? There were several, but the one that I want to focus on right now, as this is a textual history, it's Frances Burney, because there are some little pieces of Burney's own textual history that kind of seep their way into Jane's own history, which we'll get to in a second. Burney wrote a lot of different novels, but the two that I want to look at are Cecilia, which was published in 1782, and Camilla, which was 1796. Which Austen references in the 5th chapter of the Gospel of St. Jane. So let's turn to two specific pages within these books. The first is Cecilia. Now, at the end of this novel, there's this paragraph, and in this paragraph, Burney uses a certain phrase 3 times, and is very, emphatic about this phrase, puts it all in bold, and the phrase is Pride and Prejudice. Weird. Does that sound familiar, perchance? I don't know. I will put this out there, though, that I just have this sense and sensibility that if someone were to call a novel Pride and Prejudice, like, I feel like it would change the course of literature. I don't know if that's just me, but I think there's something to that. The other one, Camilla, 1796, which was actually the year that Austen began writing Pride and Prejudice, although it was called First Impressions at the time. But with Cecilia, there were a few different, or Camilla, I always get the two mixed up. There were a few different ways of publishing novels back in the day. One of them was by subscription, which basically was just crowdsourcing. So you'd get your list of subscribers, they would help you pay for the novel, and then when the novel was published, a list of their names would be included in the book. And for Camilla, we have Miss Jane Austen of Steventon. There are 2 things that I love about this. One is that, again, we see Austen like proudly declaring herself a supporter of the novels, a patron of her sister novelists, which I just think is so great. I mean, she's only 20 at the time when this happens, but she's already like, no, this is my calling, this is my vocation. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this is so this is 1796. This is the only time Jane Austen's name appears in print in her lifetime, because all of her novels were published anonymously. So on the title page it would say, by a lady, or by the author of Sense and Sensibility, by the author of Pride and Prejudice, etc. And there are a few different reasons that she did this, which I will not go into because we do not have time, but I will say that they lend her such an air of mystery. Who is this author of Sense and Sensibility? Who is this lady? I want to know more. Anyway, So that now takes us to Austen as she does begin to become a writer. And we see her still being an avid reader, even as she is writing her own things. So the first time that her work officially appears in print is 1811. However, in a magazine which was published in the late 1780s and run by Jane's brothers, Henry and James, while they were at Oxford, of the Loiterer, in this there appears a letter to the editor by one Sophia Sentiment. Now, it can't be proven that it was Jane Austen, but it's interesting because the argument that Sophia Sentiment makes in this letter feels a little bit Austenian. Because she's saying, okay, so the stuff that your magazine has produced has been good. It's been fine. It's been great. However, I feel like it would be really cool if you were to include work from among the young of both sexes, but particularly ours, so women, and let us see some nice, affecting stories. So here we have Sophia Sentiment, who, if she is Jane Austen, is this 13-year-old girl, going, no, give us fiction, give us wild Gothic stories by women, that's what we want, that's what we love. It's kind of like a proto-5th chapter of the Gospel of St. Jane, and if you want to see it in the flesh, we do have the Loiterer right here. And if you also do want to know what Jane was for sure writing when she was a teenager, her teenage writings are available to read. There's a great Oxford Classics edition that was published just a couple years ago. It's fantastic. And again, there are a lot of different things to be said about her juvenilia, her teenage writings. But the one that I want to harp on a bit is just, again, we see in these writings that she is just such a sponge. She is such a reader's writer, a writer's reader. Because what the juvenilia is it's just wild, outrageous parodies of a lot of the conventions of novels of the day. Also super violent. And there are like a lot of crazy violent deaths and drunk young women, stumbling on the way home. There's such delights, and I would recommend them reading all the way. But we see her just absorbing what she loves to read and then totally annihilating it in a fun way in her own writing. Like, you can't get the reader out of Jane Austen's DNA, even though she was writing her own material. Which takes us, of course, to her own novels. So again, this is textual history, but it's also a history of readers. And so I want not only to look at these first editions, but to look at the kinds of people who are reading the first editions, beginning with Jane herself. So let's set the scene, okay? So it's her first novel is published in 1811, that was Sense and Sensibility. Now we're in 1813. Which novel do we think this is? No, that was 1811. Her novel after Sense and Sensibility has a very similar sounding title. Pride and Prejudice. Who said that? Yes, so it is Pride and Prejudice. So this novel is published on the 28th of January, 1813, and on the 29th, Jane Austen gets, straight from London, fresh off the presses, her own copy. She calls it her own darling child. My own darling child has just arrived from London, which I love. So it's very exciting, and they're all very excited in the Austen household, Chawton Cottage. And that evening, they have a visitor over, a Miss Bench, who's just a neighbor. And they're thinking, oh, what should we do? What should we do for entertainment? And of course, Jane is still very excited about her own darling child having come from London. It's this great idea. Why don't we read, this new novel, this Pride and Prejudice by the author of Sense and Sensibility. You read that, didn't you? It was very good. Well, I just got it in today, and maybe we'll crack it open, read a chapter or two, or the entire first volume together here tonight. And so they do. And I just need you to try to envision what this must have been like. So Pride and Prejudice is brand new. It's like a day old. It's like this newborn baby. And probably by this point, no one has read the published novel cover to cover. And you're sitting in this room, probably one of the first people, if not the first people, to experience Pride and Prejudice as a published work for the first time. And who is reading it to you but Jane Austen herself? And you have no idea. Like, it's just, ugh. And I really want to get this sense ingrained in what this experience might have been like. So, can I get 2 volunteers, one of whom is okay with some attention? Okay, good. Thank you. Another? Yes. Women in the back. Let's get up here. Okay. Ooh. So, I'd like you to have, take a seat. Take a seat. Who is more okay with attention? Okay. Excellent. So you are going to be Mrs. Austen. You are going to be Miss Ben. Miss Ben, you just have to remember, we're going to put on a show, that your job is to look unsuspecting and amused, okay? Do you think you can do that? Get someone's unsuspecting but amused face. And Mrs. Austen, your job is to read it too fast and not get the character voices right. Those are Jane's own criticisms. I'm going to be Jane because I'm in charge.
So I'm Jane's mother.
You're Jane's mother. You're Mrs. Austen. So you are going to read the part of Mrs. Bennet, including the said, she, and she said.
Read
Be
Miss
very
Bennet
careful.
flatly.
Yes, yes. Remember to get the character's voice on. It's very true. And without further ado, let us begin. Okay.
There we go. We can start.
I'll start. You'll just do the Mrs. Bennet part. Okay, here we go. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering the neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters.
My dear Mr. Bennet says that
Faster.
One day, have you heard that another Popak is let it last?
Weirder. Voice weirder.
She from a song that's just been here and she told me all about it, Mr. Bennet.
That was excellent. Mr. Bennet made no answer.
Do not you want to know?
Faster.
It's taking the credit.
Faster.
You guys tell me my Jane-uary and this was invitation.
Faster.
Why am I taking you? Must know Mrs. Long says that other film is taken by you.
Weird.
Jason Ford to see the place, so was so much delighted with it that he signed with Mr. Morris immediately that he gets taken possession before it was Nicholas.
Thank you, that was excellent. Thank you so much, Mrs. Austen, for giving the subpar experience that Jane would have. That really was so good. Thank you for indulging me on that. All right, so let's move forward. So 1813, Pride and Prejudice comes out. 1814, Mansfield Park comes out, which I would love to talk about again, but we don't have time. 1815, the next novel is, does anyone have a guess?
Emma.
Emma, well done. Okay. Now, just for forewarning, this is maybe my favorite story in all of Austen lore, so just brace yourselves. I hope you love it as much as I do. All right, so Emma, a first edition of Emma. If we take one, I think this is one, and we open to directly after the title page, we get this dedication page to the Prince Regent, dedicated blah 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 blah. This is unique. It is the only dedication page that appears in Austen's novels, and the reason that this comes to be is because the Prince Regent, who is King George III's son and is kind of in charge of England until from 1811 to 1820, when George III dies, is a pretty big Jane Austen fan, as it happens. And the Prince Regent's librarian, James Stanyer Clark, knows this, and he himself is a Jane Austen fan, and so he gets in contact with Austen. And the letter doesn't exist anymore, but what it basically said was, "Dear Madam, you have the permission from the Prince and Queen to publish, to dedicate your next novel to an XOXO Clark." Austen returns with, like, okay, cool, I have a question though, just for clarification. When you say permission, does that mean like I can if I want, or like I have to by royal command? And Clark says, it means you have to by royal command. This is unfortunate for Jane because she hated the Prince Regent, letter to Jane's friend Martha, she said, "Poor woman, I shall support her as long as I can because she's a woman and because I hate her husband." She definitively hates the Prince Regent. So there you go. But she has to dedicate it to him, and so she does. And it's funny actually if you read it, it's like a very underwhelming dedication to the Royal Highness the Prince Regent. This work is by His Royal Highness's permission, most respectfully dedicated by His Royal Highness's dutiful and obedient humble servant, the author. It's just like, okay, here's what she wanted. And I think that story itself would be great if we were to end there. But wait, there's more. Because in the same letter that they kind of clear up the business of what this permission thing means, Clark is like, hey, so I was just thinking that if you were like, I don't know, to write your next novel about like the life and work of a clergyman, he was himself a clergyman, weird coincidence, that would be like kind of cool. I feel like that would go pretty well. Jane says, you know, that is a great suggestion, and I really do appreciate that, and I wish I would be able to pull something like that off, but I assure you, I am not. Thanks, God. Not to be deterred, though. The Clark comes back and he says, okay, what? You just make the clergyman how you want to. Like, this is your clergyman, okay? But if you did want a suggestion, I think it would be a very affecting scene if you had this clergyman burying his own mother, as I did, because the high priest in the parish in which she died did not pay her remains the respect he ought to do. I have never recovered from the trauma. I was like, if you wanted to, you have my complete permission to just write the novel about me. She doesn't. But again, not to be deterred, he comes back a few months later and he's like, Jane, this is going to blow your mind. I just had the best idea. This is going to bring you so much wealth and fame if you were to write a historical romance about the House of Coburg. She says, okay, you are very, very kind in your hints as to the sort of composition which might recommend me at present, but I could no more write a romance than an epic poem. I could not sit seriously down to write a serious romance under any other motive than to save my life, and if it were indispensable for me to keep it up and never relax into laughing at myself or other people, I'm sure I should be hung before I finish the first chapter. No! I must keep to my own style and go in my own way. No, I think that story would be great if it ended there, but wait, there is more. So the interaction, and they did actually end up meeting, he gave her a tour of the Prince's library. The interaction itself, if you read the letters, is just a hoot and a half to watch him like having no idea that she thinks he's an idiot. But they each came away from this producing an additional document that I think really reflects how they reacted to each other. For Jane, it was what's called plan of a novel according to hints from various quarters, the hints coming from J.S. Clark. And it's this outline and it's so fun to read, you can find it online. It's this outrageous, this outline for an outrageous novel that does take his suggestions as well as makes fun of other conventions in novels at the time. Like, there's this one part where she's like, the heroine's father in his last dying breath decides to impart to the heroine all the wisdom he has for 5 hours. And it's just delightful. It is such a delight. So there's that. What Clark does, so about 15-20 years ago, scholars discovered this little scrapbook thing that Clark kept called his friendship book. And in it, there were, see where this is going, don't you? There were different like verses from poets that he liked or signatures from people that he admired or respected, and also 2 unidentified portraits of women. The first was eventually identified as Princess Charlotte II. Scholars are pretty sure was Jane Austen, looking very glamorous. And so what I love about this is you have Jane, who's writing her plan of a novel, which totally rips into Clark and all of his ideas, and you have Clark over here doodling Jane looking fine. Okay, you know what I see this as? I see this as Clark just having a crush on Jane Austen, and I think it's like the saddest and most pathetic and funniest thing. So that is why this is one of my favorite stories of all Austen lore. We're going to change gears for just a moment. to the next published novels, which were published together. And does anyone know what's left?
Jane-uary and Persuasion.
Hold on. So Jane-uary and Persuasion. One of the notable things about these novels when they were published is that they included a biographical notice of the author. So this finally declared Jane Austen to be the author of these novels. And it came at this time with these novels because it was published in December of 1817. In July of 1817, 6 months earlier, Jane Austen died in Manchester. This is 8 College Street. That's Winchester Cathedral where she's buried. Those are my shoes standing above her face. And something that really interests me about the biographical notice, see there it is, there's Jane Austen's name appearing associated with her work in print for the first time. But one thing that I think is interesting about the biographical notice is if you read contemporary reviews, or reviews from the time, half of them will be devoted, like half of each review will be devoted to the biographical notice itself, and then the other half is the novel. Which I think is really interesting, because they spend the first half talking about like how gutted they are to learn that this novelist has died, because for them it feels like it's a personal blow. And this one, the Untitled magazine, it talks about how it feels like they've got an invitation to a funeral of just a very close friend. I think this is interesting because this is still kind of how it is. 200 years on, when people often will read Jane Austen and love Jane Austen, it's because they feel like she's writing for them, like they have their own personal Jane Austen, and this has been going on since the very beginning. But of course, most people who have read and loved an Austen novel never knew her personally. But the person who did know her the very, very best was her sister, Cassandra. When they were kids, their mother said if Cassandra were going to have her head cut off, Jane would insist on sharing her fate. They're very close. They're the only sisters that the other has. And part of the reason why they continue to keep their very close bond into adulthood is neither one of them marries, and so they continue to live together. Cassandra's fiance, she was engaged, but her fiance died at sea. Jane was actually engaged for one night and one night only before calling it off, which was the right choice. Because if she had married him, her name would have been Jane Bigwither, and that would have been just a travesty. She also had like a couple little flirtations and things, but nothing, seriously going toward matrimony. So they never marry. They continue on being spinsters together. Jane called them the Formidables, which I also just love. So they're each other's confidant. They're each other's best friend. For Jane, Cassandra is the springboard for her ideas, her first critic. And when Jane died, Cassandra wrote, "I have lost such a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can have been surpassed. She was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. I have not a thought concealed from her, and it is as if I had lost a part of myself." Let me tell you something. So this picture was taken in July of 2022, and I was reading this letter aloud, and my own sister, who's right there, was sitting right there, and it was like, oh, I didn't cry, but I came very, very close. So if we go back to Persuasion, there's a passage in the 4th chapter, so kind of early on in the novel, when it's talking about Anne Elliot, the heroine, and her backstory, kind of this tragic tale of lost love. There's this line at the end: "She had been forced into prudence in her youth. She learned romance as she grew older, the natural sequel of an unnatural beginning." So let's just sit for a second, because in a copy, a first edition of Persuasion that lives in Texas and is widely believed to have belonged to Cassandra, she wrote right next to that passage, "Dear, dear Jane, this deserves to be written in letters of gold." And I love this a lot because it's still Cassandra engaging with Jane's novels in the way that they probably would have if she had still been alive. And for that, it feels especially poignant when you know that both Jane and Cassandra had been forced into prudence in their youth, learned romance as they grew older, their lives were the natural sequel of an unnatural beginning, and that when they were weathering these storms, they were weathering it together. Like it feels personal to Jane, it feels personal to Cassandra, and I love that we kind of have that documentation of that. I just think it's so tender. Anyway, so Jane's dead. So now that she is, and her novels are now all out in the world, her first editions are in circulation, second editions, and various reprints. I want to talk about the kinds of readers that she had after she had died. And to do this, we do need to familiarize yourself with the term Jane-ites. There might be one sitting next to you. You'll never know. And it actually, this works really, really well for a textual history of Jane Austen, because the very first time that the word Jane-ite was used was in this book here. This is, besides the first edition, the most famous edition of Pride and Prejudice, the 1894 Peacock edition, with illustrations by Hugh Thompson, published by George Allen. You're free to look at that after. But in it, it has a preface by George Saintsbury. And he refers to Jane Austen fans as Austinians and Janeites. This term, though, really begins to gain traction 30 years later when Rudyard Kipling wrote a story called The Janeites, and in it he talks about how these soldiers are fighting in World War I, and they take solace in reading the works of Jane Austen as they're, suffering in the trenches. And if you want to see, we have it in its first short story form, not in a magazine, in this book, Debits and Credits. It's a weird story, but it's also kind of fun. So there we have Janeites as a term. Let's talk about some famous Janeites for just a second. Some of you might be going, wait a second. Mark Twain was not a Janeite. Wasn't he the one who said, every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and beat her over the skull with her own shin bone? Yes, but I do think it's interesting that he says every time I read Pride and Prejudice. He's going back to this. It's his guilty pleasure. Anyway, there's some other ones. And this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but Walter Scott was a Janeite, and he was the biggest and most successful novelist during Jane Austen's time, as well as most of the 19th century. Virginia Woolf, my second favorite novelist, who could the first be? I don't know, said some really great insightful things about Austen. And then C.S. Lewis, who said a lot of things about Austen too, listed her as one of his comfort reads for when he's sick. Now he's not the only prominent 20th century British figure to do this. There is a page in his one individual's memoir where he talks about how, when he's, during a period when he's sick, he reads Sense and Sensibility and has Pride and Prejudice read to him. I don't know, can anyone read the signature right there? That's right, it's Winston Churchill. Also, he would also read it to take kind of the stresses off of trying to manage World War II, which makes sense. Now, before I move on to the nobody Janeites, which, we proudly represent, I do want to tell one more story about a famous Janeite, and that is the singer Kelly Clarkson. Massive fan of Jane Austen, as it happens, and about 10 years ago, this ring that belonged to Jane Austen came up for sale, which, if you look at the official Jane Austen rubber duck she's wearing, I'll pass that around. That duck is also from Chawton, where Jane Austen lived. Anyway, so about 10 years ago, the ring came up for sale, and Kelly Clarkson bought it. And the nation was in an uproar, because not only did someone have the audacity to buy Jane Austen's ring, but an American did. She's trying to take it away from us. She's trying to take it overseas. So what the British government actually does is they put up an export ban for just enough time so that the Jane Austen House Museum can buy back the ring from Kelly Clarkson, which they do in no small part because an anonymous donor donated £100,000 to get this ring back. And so it's like if you've heard of the Blitz spirit before, like a nation coming together during World War II, this is a nation coming together over Jane Austen. Like, I just love this so much. And I'm pleased to tell you that after all this time, it's just recently come out that the anonymous donor was Charity Ford. I wish. Okay, so not famous Janeites. So it's like fun to look at famous Janeites and their experiences with Austen's novels, but the reason that Austen is a big deal is not because a few famous people have read and liked her over time. It's because a bunch of nobodies like us have read and liked her over time. So this is really the story of how Janeites came to this. Alright. to occupy you for the duration of your trip. This is not a new idea. This actually predates planes themselves. We're going to go back in time. Whoa! Your transitions are cool things. To the age of trains. So in the 1840s, the Rutledge Publishing Company came out with their railway library. And these were just cheap, paper-bound, the precursor to paperbacks, novels that you'd buy for a shilling. At one railway station, you'd read it, you'd finish the novel, and at the next railway station, you'd throw it away. And this idea of cheaply produced books, published or sold also for really cheap, began to catch on. And one of the iterations of this was the yellowback. Now, again, one of the kind of core tenets of a lot of paperbacks and proto-paperbacks is that they are kind of trashy novels, right? So you have things published like Mrs. Brown at Brighton, battling an octopus, I guess. Did she love him? An awkward meeting. The female detective. Oh, why Paul Farrell killed his wife. So very like tabloidy kind of titles. But of course, published in yellowback were also novels by eminent authors like Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, Jules Verne, and our girl Jane Austen. Now these are supposed to be kind of trashy novels, and so the cover art that they choose for Pride and Prejudice is a scene that happens off stage because it says lurid as they could get of Lydia flirting with officers at Brighton, which again you never actually see in the book, but they're like, this is what will get the masses flocking to buy this novel. Other Austen novels are published in yellowback, and we actually have one here from the collection of our very own Sam, which you can come up and see after as well. And we see a very distraught Marianne mourning the loss of her lover. So again, very like, whoa, kind of covers. Now if we go forward in time, about 100 years to the age of the actual paperback, this is a very, very critical moment for the history of Jane Austen because up until the mid-20th century, she was read pretty indiscriminately by both men and women. But in the age and the rise of the paperback, which began in the late 30s, the publishers had this idea of like, okay, well, how can we get the audience, the readers who aren't reading, classic works of literature all the time, how do we cater to them? Specifically women. Let's get some women readers. They like trashy novels, don't they? Well, why don't we reissue Jane Austen's novels in overly feminine, overly pink, and very period inaccurate paperback covers. So this is when Jane Austen becomes chick lit. This is when she becomes an author for women readers. That men are, ashamed to read or whatever. But of course, if we're talking about significant texts and ways of distributing Austen through text to give her a more mass market appeal, we must discuss film scripts. This is the script for the 1995 Pride and Prejudice by Andrew Davies, with Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy and Jennifer Ely as Elizabeth Bennet. Let's just give it a round of applause. So this was a big deal, and introduced a whole new kind of audience to Jane Austen. Not necessarily the people who would think to, pick up an old 19th century novel, but just the kind of person who will sit down and watch a period drama for 6 hours. And it does a lot of things to kind of gain popularity and success. The most significant of these, of course, being that it brings about this. Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy jumping into a lake. Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy walking out of a lake in a wet shirt. Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy being so shy. And this was a sensation. This was a massive hit. So much so that a few years ago, someone decided to make a 13-foot statue, which has had time in various farms around the world. Here it is from a few different angles. Its legacy lives on in other film and adaptations and things like that. Like this guy. And so you have Lost in Austen, where they do this. You have Bridgerton, where they do this. You have Benedict Cumberbatch who's doing it for some reason. And I'm going to say, now I think that this would make a great title for my memoir. I hope it happens. It continues to live on in film and success. A few years ago, this is Camilla. Went to visit the Jane Austen House Museum, where they had this temporarily on display and completely fangirled about it. Okay? Later that year, Charity Ford did the same thing. I touched it. So you might be thinking, okay, Charity, why belabor this point though? It's a wet shirt. It doesn't even happen in the novels. I thought this was a textual history. Well, because in 1995, we had this huge surge after this point of Austen adaptations on film. There had been one in 1940, there were a couple in the 70s, a few in the 80s, but in 1995, this is the period, this is the beginning of a new era. Not only did Pride and Prejudice, the miniseries, come out, but there was a version of Persuasion, there was a version of Sense and Sensibility, and Clueless, which is based off of Emma, came out also in that year. And in like every few years, there's just another adaptation, another adaptation, another adaptation, until, you know, the present day. We just live in a post-wet shirt world, right? Where we have so many films that are based on the novel by Jane Austen. We have so many films based selectively on the novel by Jane Austen, the best of which I must say is the 2004, I think, Bollywood adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. I just need you to experience this in a second. Oh yeah, 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 yeah. No, this obsession with Austen and film doesn't just penetrate her works. If you go to the Jane Austen House Museum, I'm pretty sure this is still there, and you go up to where the staircase goes like this, there is a gray coat on display. If you take a closer look at the plaque next to the gray coat, it says gray coat. This gray coat, overcoat was worn by the character Tom Lefroy, played by James McAvoy in the 2007 film Becoming Jane. So we also have films just based on Jane Austen. In this case, very, very loosely. In the same year though, the BBC did a made-for-television film also based loosely on the life of Jane Austen. And on May 4th of this year, May 1st of this year, Jill Quimby's novel, Miss Austen, which is actually referring to Cassandra, but we're only interested in Cassandra because she was Jane Austen's sister, is going to be, sorry, I love Cassandra, I do. That's going to be released on PBS this year. So it's not even just, you know, Jane Austen's works that we want to see be brought to life on the big screen. It's Jane Austen herself. Like, she's just become such a big deal. I mean, that idea of the personal Jane Austen, that she means so much to us just individually, regardless of her works at this point. Which leads us to the epilogue of Jane-uary, and that is the readers that are most important, maybe, probably, yes, are me, you, us. This is the copy of Pride and Prejudice that I read every year. Here it is, across the street from the Jane Austen House Museum. This photo is what you call a flex. But I first read Pride and Prejudice when I was 12, and I was just completely blown away by how funny it was. And it spoke to me through its humor initially, but as I started reading her novels, and then her teenage writings, and then her letters, and then scholarship on Austen, like, there were so many different things that I just came to love about her and her works. And as I came to interact with more people who also love Jane Austen, I mean, you see that it's a genuine love that people have, but it's a very personal, very individual kind of love that people have for Jane Austen. And I think that's one of the reasons why she is so special and so enduring, is that she's such a good shapeshifter in suiting every single person, every single reader's needs and expectations. So that is the end of Jane-uary. Do we have any questions? Yes?
How is it that the royalty people knew who to contact if her name wasn't printed?
Yeah, so it was a pretty open secret by the time Mansfield Park came out, and that was because Austen's brother Henry, who managed a lot of the business, of publication was not that demure about not letting people know that his sister was this famous novelist. And so within London, a lot of people knew. So, yeah.
Why is Northanger Abbey listed as her first novel that she started in 1801, but it's not? It's here. It's published in 1860.
Good question. So, she starts writing Northanger Abbey when she in her early 20s, the late 1790s. She finally finishes it and sends it off for publication in 1801. The publishing company, they buy it. They even advertise that they're going to publish this new novel called Susan, because at that time it was still called Susan. But then they never do. And so fast forward a few years, we're in 1809. She's now settled in Chawton. She's really settling into being a very serious writer by this point. So she writes the publishing company. She says, hey, and it's actually an excellent, excellent letter. I'd recommend reading it. She says, so, where is it? Where is it? I thought you were going to publish this. Like, if you can't do it, that's fine. Just let me know. I will find someone else. Or if you need a new copy, if you've lost it, I will give you another copy. And she signs it Mrs. Ashton Dennis. And when you abbreviate that, that's M-A-D. I am, etc. mad. And actually, in Northanger Abbey, when it was published, so she went back and she revised it in a few different times. Because they did sell her the copyright back. She went back, she revised it a few times, and in 1816 she wrote an advertisement for it. I'm not going to look for it right now, but it's essentially the same thing. Like, I'm sorry that some of these things are outdated, but someone just didn't, publish it when they were supposed to. So that's why it took so long. Yeah, were there any? Yes.
How did she pass away?
So that's a good question. Well done, everyone. Good question. How did she pass away? No one can be super sure because it's hard to diagnose things so retrospectively or retroactively. And so there are a few different theories. One is Addison's disease, which was posited, I think, in the 60s, but that's kind of been debunked a little bit. A form of cancer is another theory. It's also hard to tell because you're going off of what Austen herself wrote, and she had this thing against hypochondriacs, probably because her mother was one, and so she doesn't complain a lot. Like, she underplays a lot of what she's feeling, and so it's kind of hard to tell what she was suffering from. But yeah, she died in the early morning hours of the 18th of July, 1817, in her sister's arms. The last words were, "I want nothing but death." Isn't that just like...
How long was she sick?
She was sick for about a year. Yeah. Weird thing is, so Persuasion was her last finished novel, and it kind of has that wistful sort of tone to it. Very fitting last novel, but interesting, she did actually start another novel called Sandington. And there were periods where it kind of looked like maybe she'd get better, but she didn't. And if she hadn't died then, she'd still be with us today. So were there any other questions? Yes.
What age did she die?
She was 41. Okay. Any other queries? I love answering questions about Jane Austen. Okay, good. And again, if you have other questions, yes?
Which, screen adaptation is your favorite?
Oh, well, all eyes just went. Okay, that's a good question. Probably the 1995 Sense and Sensibility by Emma Thompson. I think she just captures the humor, but also because Austen, I think, is really good at keeping a balance of being funny, but also being able to handle heavier topics, or the tone, I feel like, feels the most Austenian to me out of most of the adaptations. Although a lot of them are really good, some of them are not though. Any other? Yeah, again, if you do have questions or things you want to talk about, you can come up here. In the meantime, if this was interesting to you, I have some recommended reading, and so you can take a picture of this. I also do have in his handouts here. I've listed the novels in order of, I think, if you're coming to Jane Austen for the first time, I think the most effective way of approaching them. You might disagree with the order that I have, but I don't. If you're interested in learning more about Jane Austen's life, some good biography suggestions there. If you want to know more about Austen, kind of her afterlives, her reception history, got some suggestions there. My favorite one is, this is mine, this is not for sale, is The Lost Books of Jane Austen. It talks about like the cheap paperbacks and that kind of, you know, Austen gaining traction in the world of people who aren't wealthy. And then also, I have both just the favorite choices from among these. Emma's my favorite Jane Austen novel. Jane Austen, I think, is next on biography. Anyway, so yeah, I think those are yes.
I just thought of a quick number. Because she was, the author's name was not on there, and I'm not too sure how, like Dickens had to sell the subscription things and the chapters, and how did she make good money from these?
Okay.
Or was she?
Yeah, so there are a few different ways of publishing. So the question is, how did she make money? There are a few different ways. One, so Sense and Sensibility is her first novel, and she essentially self-publishes that, and so she pays for, or her brother Henry at least pays for the printing to happen, but then gets all the profit for it, and I think she made like £130 from that. With Pride and Prejudice, she just outright sells the copyright, so she gets £110 up front, but then all subsequent profits go to the publisher, which was unfortunate because Pride and Prejudice was the most successful in her lifetime. So it was just kind of self-publishing, copyright, that kind of thing. Some of them sort of canceled each other out, like the second edition of Mansfield Park didn't do very well, and it was published around the same time as Emma, and so she only made about £40 on Emma because they kind of did that. So she made decent money, but compared to the bigger novelists at the time, like Walter Scott, Mariah Edgeworth, Frances Burney, it was very modest success. So, yeah. Yes, the reading things, I think they've got around now. If you're interested in more events, the QR code will take you to Eventbrite. If you want to follow us there. January 25th, a week from today, we're doing book club at 3 p.m. We're going to be discussing The Secret Garden. On February 8th, we're going to do a wax seal workshop. PowerPoint AI did this little image of a seal for me, and I thought it was funny, so I kept it. The next event like this is going to be Friday, February 21st and February 22nd, and it's going to be about the origin of romance tropes, so like enemies to lovers, forced proximity, that kind of thing. And then March 1st is our following book club, and that will be Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped. So just keep these things on your radar. And if you also want to keep up with the things that we are doing, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram. And then last, before I let you go, this QR code will take you to a survey, which will just give you the opportunity to give feedback for the event, things you enjoyed, the things you didn't enjoy, the ways that we can improve these things. It's really, really, really helpful when people do this, because otherwise we just keep coasting and give people not actually what they want. So all responses are yes.
The Google form says we need permission to enter
Oh,
it.
do you?
Yeah.
Oh. Okay, well, I will fix that, and then I'll work on that. And then maybe if you, at the end of the night, if you just come back in here and scan it again, it should work. But it is really, really helpful when getting the feedback. All responses are anonymous and all questions are optional, so just answer as many as honestly as you can. And so yes, without further ado, that is the end of this point. If you've been with us before, you might know what's coming next. Say it louder.
Jasper says